for those of you who have woken up early in the other side of the Atlantic. I'm Mikael Linden from CSC, the Finnish IT Center for Science, which operates the Finnish National Network FUNET, and also Hacker Identity Federation, which is the Finnish Identity Federation for Research and Education. I have been involved in this GÉANT Data Protection Code of Conduct project since the beginning, and I'm kind of coordinator of this work and coordinating the lawyers from DLA Piper who have been our legal expert for the Code of Conduct. So the contents of this presentation: first, we have a short problem statement and a short introduction to the Code of Conduct 2.0 project. The majority of today's webinar will be actually presenting the details or outline of the Code of Conduct 2.0 draft. That is, by the way, the cover page is in the right-hand side. If you want to find the draft, it is in Reefers Wiki, linked from the workshop page that we had last week in Vienna as a satellite event of the Time workshop. So the problem statement. We have here a user. The user can be a student or teacher or administrational staff affiliated in one of the universities or institutes in our federations. However, it appears that the most usual scenario is that the end user is a researcher in a university, because researchers appear to be the user group in the universities who are most international and who are involved in cross-national research projects or research collaborations. And those people most desperately need access to service providers in other countries. And here in the right-hand side, we have a service provider, which is in technical speak SAML service provider. It's managed by an organization in different federation and country or even overseas. So when the researcher wants to log into the service provider, he or she first authenticates at the SAML identity provider server that their home organization manages, and then the IDP server would release the attributes to the service provider. However, the practice has shown that in many circumstances, it is not so easy to make the home organizations to release the attributes to the service provider. Even although the attributes are quite simple pieces of personal data, like the researcher's name, email address, unique identifier such as EPPN, and the researcher's role and position in the home organization, like edu-person scope affiliation. Many home organizations still feel hesitant to release those pieces of information. So the researcher contacts the IDP admin of the home organization. Please release my attributes to the service provider. I need to log into this service provider in order to do my job. And then the IDP admin comes. Sorry, we have an obligation to follow the privacy laws, and we need to protect your privacy, so we can't release your attributes. And the outcome is that the researcher is unhappy, and probably they need to find an alternative way to log into a service provider. For instance, register a local account with a local username and password, or use some commercial identity provider like Google if the service provider has enabled that for login. The approach the GÉANT Data Protection Code of Conduct has adopted is that in this project we are developing this code of conduct, this document that I will soon present to you. And we suppose the service providers to express their commitment to follow the principles described in the code of conduct. And the idea is that the SPs use the SAML2 metadata, in practice an entity category element there, to indicate that I, as a service provider, am committed to this GÉANT Data Protection Code of Conduct. And then the federations and EduGAIN Inter-Federation Service relay the SAML2 metadata to the home organization and to the IDP server there. And we hope that the home organizations feel more relaxed to release the attributes to the service providers when they can observe that they have committed to the GÉANT Code of Conduct. So the short history of the GÉANT COCO started more than 5 years ago. The first version 1.0 was published nearly 5 years ago. In June 2013, you can see it in the right-hand side. It's the COCO version 1.0, which is the one we currently use in the context of EduGAIN. And I just checked the EduGAIN entity database. Currently there are 140 service providers who have committed to the Code of Conduct 1.0 and 174 IDPs who indicate that they support attribute release to those SPs that have committed to the Code of Conduct. We submitted the COCO 1.0 to the data protection authorities in Europe, in practice Article 29 Working Party, but they were not happy to approve it. Instead, they provided us feedback that the COCO 1.0 doesn't provide sufficient added value to the data protection directive. It turned out that what Article 29 Working Party expects is that the Code of Conduct explains what the law means in the context of research and education, identity federations, and attribute release there. The COCO must be more prescriptive instead of just rephrasing the articles in the data protection directive. And that's the feedback we received, and we have now taken into account while preparing the COCO version 2.0. However, what happened after 2015 is that in April 2016, the GDPR was approved by European Parliament and Council, and well, many changes. It introduces many changes. One of the changes is that it gives more power to a code of conduct. Now a code of conduct can be used by a data controller to demonstrate they have deployed proper organizational and technical measures, and it can be also used as a legal grounds for attribute release to third countries and international organizations if the code of conduct is approved by the authorities. So we decided to shift the COCO work and delay it a bit in order to aim at COCO 2.0 to be compliant with the GDPR when it becomes effective. And we have still, I think, a little more than 3 months left before GDPR becomes effective. So that's the day when we can then submit the new COCO version 2.0 to the data protection authorities for the approval. The first public consultation of the COCO version 2 took place 1 year ago. And now it is the time to announce the second public consultation of the Code of Conduct version 2.0. So the consultation is open until the end of February this, so until the end of this month. And the draft COCO is, the PDF is available in that link. Please have a look at it, please review it, please provide your comments to the Google Doc that is linked from the page where the PDF can be downloaded. We intend to supplement the Code of Conduct with an explanatory memorandum, which is submitted to the authorities together with the COCO, and which kind of explains our community and the requirements of our community and how we believe the COCO would meet those requirements. You can provide comments on the explanatory memorandum as well. We plan to have a little more lightweight procedure for reviewing those comments. So please use the Google comment tool directly to that document. So for the rest of this webinar, I plan to use for explaining the approaches the COCO takes to various GDPR requirements. And this is the basic structure of the COCO. We have 18 clauses which cover requirements coming from the GDPR. And then we have 4 appendices. One on the duty of the service provider to inform the end users, such as privacy notices. Second appendix on information security requirements. Third appendix on how to handle non-compliance. And then a glossary of terms. So at first, the territorial scope of the Code of Conduct. So the service providers are the data controllers committing to the Code of Conduct, and the COCO is directly applicable to the service providers in EU countries, plus other European Economic Area countries, which means Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. And also those service providers in countries where that belong to the whitelist that European Commission manages for countries providing adequate data protection. I think there are countries like Switzerland and Argentina there. But then, according to the GDPR, a COCO, an approved Code of Conduct, can be used as the legal grounds to release attributes also to other countries if those data controllers have made binding and enforceable commitments to the Code of Conduct. It's something new in the GDPR, Article 46. And the table in the right-hand side kind of illustrates in the rows, we have the service provider, and in the columns, the home organization. So if both home organization and service provider are in EU or EEA or in the whitelist country, then the COCO is obviously applicable there. But if a service provider committing to the GDPR and the COCO convinces a home organization outside EU, it's of course possible for those home organizations to rely on the Code of Conduct for the attribute release as well. If the service provider is outside EU and EEA and the whitelist countries, It is possible for them to commit to the code of conduct and retrieve attributes from European home organizations, provided the service provider has made binding and enforceable commitments to the COCO. And also, if both home organization and service provider are outside EU and whitelist countries, it can be used, although I'm not sure if it's really relevant in that scenario when neither the home organization nor the service provider is in EU EEA. The functional scope of the COCO is release of attributes for enabling access to the service. So those attributes the service provider requests from the home organizations and uses for enabling access to the service. The service providers or communities of service providers, such as e-infrastructures or research infrastructures, can voluntarily agree to apply the COCO also to other attributes, such as attributes managed by a local attribute provider or attribute authority. We think that's useful scenario, for instance, those distributed computing infrastructures like EGI, which want to share the user's consumption of compute resources as an extra attribute the community wants to manage for the users by themselves. The actual service content is out of scope for this code of conduct. For instance, if the service is a data archive for sensitive human data, genomics data, proteomics, and so on, that's out of scope. The COCO covers only the end users, such as the researchers' attributes, which need to be released for the researcher to access the service. But the research data sets is out of scope. Also, those attributes that the service provider gathers directly from the user are out of scope. So, for the rest of the webinar, I will go through those clauses of the COCO 2.0 draft. And the first one is the precedence of the COCO, and the intention is that if there is a direct agreement between the home organization or service provider, it takes precedence. It takes priority over the code of conduct. We will see how the authorities will react to that. It is possible we will receive a comment that if you want to use the COCO to legitimate the data processing or attribute release, you shouldn't have a mechanism to override it. But that's the draft we have in the current COCO. So COCO comes second and the GDPR comes third. And then the applicable law and jurisdiction. So if there's a need to go to a court, it has written to the current draft that Dutch laws and Dutch courts are competent or applicable there. The reason for selection of Dutch law is that the Netherlands is the home of the GÉANT Association. It was the best approximation we could take to decide which would be the proper jurisdiction and applicable law for the COCO. However, the home organization and service provider, or whoever has the dispute, can also agree to use some other law and jurisdiction. For instance, some federations may decide to integrate the code of conduct to the national federation policy and make it available for all service providers, even although they are never exposed to eduGAIN or foreign identity providers. And that may even be a good idea, but it's a local decision for the federation operators. But if both the home organization and service provider are, let's say, in Finland, it probably makes sense that those two can agree to use, let's say, Finnish laws and court instead of going to Amsterdam. Purpose of processing. So clause B of the Code of Conduct defines that the service providers will use the attributes released by the home organization for enabling access to the service. That's a phrase we used already in COCO 1.0 and we continue using in COCO 2.0. What we have actually done in this COCO 2.0 is that we have been more prescriptive that what it means, what enabling access to a service means in practice for the service providers. And we have things like authorization of the user and identification of the user if identifying the end users is necessary for the service. But we have also accountability and invoicing if that's in the scope of the service, how much, let's say, compute good that the user has consumed in the service. So that's enabling access to the service as well as written to the COCO draft. And we have also added some more prescriptive examples like information security, managing the information security of the service provider, which enables the service provider to gather logs to guarantee the integrity and availability of the service. Clause C then defines how to use the attributes for other purposes than enabling access to the service. And it is possible, but the user needs to give consent for the deviating purpose. And clause L then defines consent. Well, actually it rephrases what the GDPR requires on consent. So it must be freely given, specific, informed, and must unambiguously indicate end user's wishes. And there has been discussion in the research and education community that, and also in the recitals of the GDPR, it is mentioned that employees may have difficulties to give freely given consent if the attribute release is required for a researcher to be able to do their job properly. So consent has limited applicability in the context of this code of conduct. And actually we don't even propose to use consent as the legal grounds for the home organization to release the attributes to the service provider. Data minimization is one of the requirements in GDPR. And the service provider commits to request from home organization only those attributes that are adequate, relevant, and not excessive for the purpose of processing. So it means for enabling access to the service. So in the reasoning of the COCO, we actually list plenty of attributes. For instance, attributes like edu-person scoped affiliation can be used for authorization, and attributes like EPPN or SAML2 persistent ID can be used for identification of the user. But when several attributes can be used, the least intrusive should be selected. So prefer SAML2 persistent ID over EPPN if you don't have a particular need to have a shared identifier like EPPN or EPUID. Clause G of the COCO is on data retention, and the attributes need to be deleted or anonymized when they are no longer needed for enabling access to the service. And that's the principle, but it's a nasty principle in the context of service providers. The general idea is that if the user wishes no longer to use the service, the attributes need to be deleted. However, in practice, users seldom explicitly tell to the service provider that now I have stopped using your service. Instead, they just never log in again. And now the principle that the COCO proposes is that if the user hasn't shown up for 18 months, the service provider should interpret that the user has stopped using the service and delete the attributes. And then there are some exceptions to that principle, like if the service provider is about publishing scientific results, the researcher probably still wants to have the name attached to their findings, even although they don't log into the service provider. Or if the service is a data archive where the researcher can deposit the data sets, the researcher probably still wants to be the kind of custodian of the data sets, even although they don't necessarily log in for 18 months. So that's where we try to be a bit more prescriptive in COCO 2.0, and where we also try to provide some hints or advices which are practical help for the service provider admins. Next one is information duty. The duty of the service provider to inform the end user on the processing of their attributes. And in the Appendix 1 of the COCO, we have a template for privacy notice that we think complies with what GDPR requires. And then the service providers can make use of the template. It has very practical things like links to the SAML2 metadata MDUI elements. And then the service provider has an obligation to provide a link to the privacy notice. In practice, it is the MDUI privacy statement URL SAML2 metadata element that the service provider must populate. And the idea is that then the home organization can pick up the link to the service provider's privacy notice and present it to the end user at the time when they log into the service for the first time, but before any attribute release takes place. So those modules we call consent modules or inform modules in the IDP side could make use of that link and do some more privacy-related favors for the user. Next one is information security measures. So the service provider commits to make appropriate technical and organizational measures to protect the attributes. And in practice, in Appendix 2 of the COCO 2.0, we have certified which is the most widely adopted security framework for SAML service providers in our community, at least to the extent we are aware of it. And the idea is that the service provider has an obligation to report. Well, GDPR requires that the data protection authorities are informed on security incidents where the personal data is exposed or in risk. And also the data subjects need to be informed if the security incident is severe. Now we extend this in the COCO, we extend this requirement that the service provider needs to inform also the home organization if there is a security incident. For instance, if the service provider thinks the user account in the IDP is compromised, the service provider must inform the home organization that the home organization should, for instance, close down or check if there is an issue with the user account. Some service providers may want to further release the attributes to another organization or another data controller or service provider. And it is possible, according to clause J of the COCO, only if the third party is a data processor for the service provider. So if the third party processes attributes on behalf of the service provider. Or if also the third party is committed to the code of conduct. And this setup seems to get popularity in the research and e-infrastructure community, that the community has one SAML service provider, which is a Proxy IDP SP, which acts as a service provider towards the home organization and receives the attributes from the home organization. And then it may further release the attributes, act as an IDP to further release the attributes to other service providers in the research community. And the COCO leaves the door open for this setup, but it requires that also those third parties who receive the attributes are committed to the code of conduct. And the third alternative is that the user consents to the attribute release. It is also possible that the attributes are released from EU or EEA or countries with adequate protection to those countries or international organizations who don't provide adequate protection. And that is possible if the transfer is protected by the COCO, so the receiver of the transfer is committed to the COCO, or other measures which are adequate according to the GDPR, such as the model contracts or standard contractual clauses that European Commission publishes, or consent, if that's applicable. Then some more COCO sections. Liability. In order to encourage the home organizations to release attributes to the service providers, the liability clause M requires that the service provider holds the home organization harmless, or the end user harmless if the service provider has a problem which causes damage to the home organization. And clause O is just a reminder that the service provider, the person administrating the SAML service provider, should probably consult the managers before they make a commitment to the code of conduct on behalf of the organization that manages the service provider. So the commitment to the COCO must be carried out by authorized person and not necessarily the person who manages the SP server is that person. And finally, the termination of the COCO is possible if the COCO is replaced by a similar arrangement or the SP stops serving, providing the service, or terminates the COCO. So the COCO has 4 appendixes. Appendix 1 was on the informing the end user, so the privacy notice template. Appendix 2 was the certify, covered in the context of technical and organizational measures. But Appendix 3 is something still not covered. Appendix 3 describes what anyone, such as an end user or home organization or federation operator, can do if they think a service provider is not compliant with the code of conduct, even although they indicate they have committed to it. So the end user or home organization or federation operator can contact the service provider directly and ask them to check if they have an issue and correct it. Or they can contact the home federation operator of the service provider and ask them to contact the service provider. Depending on the local policy of the home federation, the federation operator may have also some other means to enforce or influence to the service providers, such as suspension of the service provider temporarily or permanently if the home federation thinks the service provider is not compliant. The end user or home organization can contact the COCO monitoring body, which will be presented in the next slide. And there's always the opportunity to lodge a complaint with the competent supervisory authority. So the data protection authority. COCO monitoring body is something new and something that is mandatory for codes of conduct under the GDPR. So it is something new to everyone. It's something new to the GÉANT community, but also to the data protection authorities. So little previous work or information is available. What kind of organizations these monitoring bodies can be and will be. So in the Code of Conduct, Appendix 3, we describe the Code of Conduct monitoring body is a body that the federation operator can nominate, and once nominated by the federation operator, the supervisory authority needs to accredit the monitoring body in order for the body to become competent. The idea is that the different federations can have separate monitoring bodies. They can have also a common monitoring body. For instance, if GÉANT Association or GÉANT project wants to nominate a central monitoring body. But the idea is that the monitoring body follows the service provider's home federation, so that federation where the service provider is registered. In order to qualify, the monitoring body needs to be independent. And in Appendix 3, we have written that basically the power that the monitoring body has is to remove the service provider's COCO tag, or mandate the home federation to remove that tag from the service provider's metadata. So it's basically a body that screens if the service provider appears to violate the COCO, and then remove the COCO compliance from GÉANT or federation metadata. And the decisions made by the monitoring body can then be appealed to the competent data protection authority. So those were the short introduction of the Code of Conduct contents and clauses. Please have a look at the COCO in the PDF available. Please provide comments before the public consultation ends in the end of this month. After the public consultation closes, we will review the comments and integrate them to the COCO draft. And then, based on the nature of the comments, we may need to reiterate 25th of May this year is the first day when we can submit the COCO to the supervisory authority, so the data protection authority, which will then relay it to the European Data Protection Board, which replaces Article 29 Working Party. And EDPB will provide an opinion on the COCO, and if the opinion is that it should be, that if the opinion is to endorse the COCO, then the European Commission will publish the COCO. And only, well, we can possibly start to use the COCO even before it is approved by the authorities, but only the approval of the COCO gives the new powers that COCO codes of conduct have under GDPR, such as using the COCO as a legal grounds for attribute release out of EU. We haven't found specifications from GDPR on how long the supervisory authority can process the COCO, but before it needs to provide a response to us. But the European Data Protection Board needs to process the COCO in 8 weeks, or in certain circumstances it may have 6 weeks more time for processing the COCO. So the good news is that there are some time limits in GDPR. The bad news is that we can't use the full power of the COCO yet in the end of May, but it takes some time to iterate and have it approved by the authorities. At least some months or even more. In the technical track of the COCO, well, we need to issue a URI of the document. We probably need to update the SAML2 metadata profile and entity category specification that we have defined for the COCO version 1. And we need to update the monitoring tool we use that the monitoring tool browses through GÉANT metadata and makes some technical checks to those SPs who claim they are compliant with the COCO. And then what requires a lot of work is, of course, to disseminate the information, to coordinate the uptake of the COCO 2.0, and we really need to coordinate that work and do it together with the federation operators, because those are the parties that actually manage the SAML2 metadata and manage the communities where the service providers are registered. So this is the end of my webinar. If you have questions, you can send me email or have a look at the COCO document or the COCO project webpage. The links are there. Or you can present the questions now. So please, now it's time for the questions.
Thank you, Mikael. Just a quick notice to everybody. I will stop the recording now so you can answer all the questions.